Nelson Mandela once said, "As long as poverty, injustice, and gross inequality persist in our world, none of us can truly rest." Born July 18th, 1918, in Viso, South Africa, Nelson Mandela uh, always fought for equal rights for his people. As a young boy, he heard stories of his ancestors and dreamed himself of one day fighting for the freedom of his people. Today in my speech, I'll talk about what Nelson Mandela fought against, who he fought for, and how this led to his imprisonment. So Nelson Mandela was fighting against apartheid. Apartheid was a system of government in which was implemented in South Africa, which had intense segregation laws that in a lot of parts of the world they had already went through their independence stages, but South Africa implemented theirs a lot later. So according to an article from essayhistory.org from January 17, 2019, titled "A History of Apartheid in South Africa," apartheid was implemented in South Africa in 1948. In apartheid, racial groups were forced to live separately. The money differential was very unequal, and the majority of the population was very disadvantaged. A couple of examples of apartheid rules and laws that were the basis of apartheid are the Population Registration Act, which forced all population groups to sign up and register to their certain racial group, and then they were treated differently according to their racial group. And another law of apartheid was the Group Areas Act, which was a physical separation between races. This called for the removal of groups in large cities to their own separate areas, so that way racial groups would be more separated and have to live on their own, most of them in severe poverty. So where there's something bad, there's always something to fight it, which in this case was the African National Congress. The African National Congress has been South Africa's leading political party since 1994. It was originally founded in 1912 with the aim to fight for the rights of blacks in South Africa. It started sponsoring nonviolent protest in 1952 as a response to apartheid being implemented 4 years earlier. Possibly the most famous ANC-led protest was in Sharpeville. The Sharpeville protests were actually led by the Pan-African Congress and the African National Congress, but the Pan-African Congress, also known as the PAC, was just people from the African National Congress that broke off into a more violent form of protest. So according to an article by the New York Times from March 21st, 2012, titled March 21st, 1960, South African police kill 69 black protesters in Sharpeville massacre. Sharpeville was described as the turning point for apartheid. 5,000 to 7,000 protesters gathered in Sharpeville, a very small town south of Johannesburg, and they surrounded a police station in protest. And all of a sudden, for not really an apparent reason, the police randomly started firing into this large crowd of 5,000 to 7,000, and 69 black nonviolent protesters were killed, and over 200 were wounded. Afterwards, the government issued their first state of emergency, and the African National Congress and the Pan-African Congress were both banned. So every great protest has a great leader, and that leader happened to be Nelson Mandela. According to an article by nelsonmandela.org titled "Biography of Nelson Mandela," he joined the African National Congress in 1944. He was arrested in 1956, shortly after being banned from being considered a restricted person in South Africa for treason. Many people were arrested for this treason trial, as it became known, and the treason trial ended up lasting almost 5 years, a little over 4, and it turned out that after all this time, nobody was actually considered guilty. Everyone was acquitted of their charges. So, but after all this, after being a restricted person and being put on trial for treason, he was closely watched by the South African government. And in 1962, he took up a new name and secretly left South Africa to go to England to spread awareness of apartheid and its evils in England. And when he returned, he was quickly arrested for leaving the country without a permit and inciting workers to strike. This is the first time that Nelson Mandela is put in prison for 5 years. And while he's in prison, obviously he can't lead any protest, and the ANC is already banned, so they can't have any protests without all getting arrested. But while he's in prison in Rivonia, Johannesburg, a ANC secret hideout is busted, and along with 10 others, Nelson Mandela is put on trial for sabotage. So in this Rivonia trial, he is punishable by being hung. And while he's facing the crowd in front of the court, he has a famous speech, and his last words have become very famous. He said, "I have fought against white domination, and I have fought against black domination. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony, with equal opportunities. It is an ideal with which I hope to live for and to achieve, but if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die." So, in June 11th, 1964, Nelson Mandela, along with 7 others, are sentenced to life in prison. So, in conclusion, Nelson Mandela was in prison for 27 years, and he was not let out until 1990, after apartheid is finally dismantled, after constant protests from still ANC leaders who are not in prison, and also other countries heavily pressured South Africa to end their segregation. And when Nelson Mandela comes out of prison, he takes over that leadership role with the ANC that he had before, and he becomes the first black president in South Africa in 1994, and he creates the first democracy in South Africa. So in this speech, I covered apartheid, which is who Nelson Mandela fought against, the ANC, who Nelson Mandela fought for, and why he went to prison. And I'll leave you the same way I started, with a quote by Nelson Mandela. "It always seems impossible until it's done." Thank you.